in the winter when the fish are not moving as much, they're not feeding as much, and generally they're a lot harder to catch, solid bags for me are an incredible way of getting more and more bites. And in this video, I'm going to show you exactly how I fish my solid bags, specifically in the winter months. So firstly, why use a solid bag in the winter? For me, they are a brilliant one bite tactic. You're not going to overfeed the fish, and it's a really great way of drawing them down and getting them to home in on your rig without putting loads of bait down. So also, the rig that you use inside the PVA bag, I think is just about as an effective rig as you can possibly get. You're using quite a big heavy inline lead, you've got a really nice short supple braided hook link, and then you've got a really sharp hook that's attached to a bait that is balanced to perfection. All of those combined means that the hook bait's going to fly back as far as possible into the fish's mouth, and that means it's got much further to come out when it tries to eject it, which gives it more chance of catching hold and you getting a bite. And I think that it is the most effective rig that you could possibly use. A lot of my winter fishing tends to be day sessions and short sort of overnighters, so I want to cut my gear back and I want to be as minimal as possible, and fishing solid bags definitely helps me to do that. Now, pretty much for most of my sessions, all I'll bring with me is my solid bag bucket, and that's all prepped up with all of the stuff that I need to get me through a winter session in terms of bait. On the top, I've got my insert, so that keeps all of my end tackle, my pots of hook baits, my PVA bags, etc. separate from my main bait, so it doesn't all get horrible and all oily. So in there I've got my PVA bags, got a couple of pots of hook baits, I've got some powders that I help dry all of my end tackle off, and of course I've got my loading tools and PVA tape should I need to tie up some mega long range bags. And then inside my bucket I've got my bag of maggots. This is a 4-pint bag, and I've completely sealed them off. So generally when I buy my maggots, I'm sort of buying them consistently throughout the winter, and I tend to separate them off into 4-pint bags and completely seal them so that they're airtight. And the reason that I do that is it sort of puts the maggots into a torpid state. It makes them a lot easier to deal with, they last a lot longer, and yeah, you can get more into a bag, they can press down better, and I just find them easier to deal with, and it doesn't affect the efficiency or the effectiveness of the maggots. Generally, I think a lot of people say that it's the movement of the maggots that help them catch fish, but I don't believe that to be true, because I've been doing this for an awful long time and I've caught an awful lot of fish using maggots. So yeah, completely sealed off. It makes them also a lot easier to tie in the bags. So that's them. And then also, of course, in my solid bag bucket I've got my pellet mix, and my pellet mix is literally exactly the same as what it's always been. I don't change it from the summer to the winter. There's halibut pellets in there, it's CC Moore oily bag mix as well, and there's some extra salmon fry microfeed in there. So really actually quite oily ingredients that a lot of people say you shouldn't use in winter, but that for me is a more effective pellet mix than one that's got less oils in and, to me, less attraction in. One thing that I don't do though is I don't add any oil. I've always got my oil in my pellet bucket, sorry. But I don't add this. In the summer I do, but I don't add it now. You'll actually be able to see in that bottle a lot of it has sort of congealed at the bottom, and that is why you don't want to be using loads of oil in the winter months. But yeah, that's my bait for my winter fishing and for my solid bags. When it comes to my rig for solid bags, I also feel like hook bait choice is very important. I need something that's going to be small, that fits nicely in the solid bag. I need something that's going to be lightweight so that it sinks the hook really, really slowly. And I need something that's going to obviously be attractive to the carp. So firstly, my sort of main go-to hook bait, especially if I'm fishing it with a maggot bag, is a maggot hook bait. Now, what I've done here is I've attached the maggots to a piece of bait floss, and then they've been threaded onto the hair. Effectively, it's just a normal hair rig, and then butted up against that piece of cork. Now that piece of cork sinks the hook really, really slowly, so it just sits up off of the point like so. I'm using a stiff rig beak point hook, so the beak point in this instance is important because you've got that beak, and having the hook sat like that with the beak point, you're not going to damage the point of the hook on the lake bed. You'll also notice that I've got a piece of silicone that's just trapping the hair, and that's in line with the barb, and that way it makes sure that the hook sits exactly how I want it to, in that claw-like pose. And I know a lot of people, when they're fishing wafters and things like that, they like their hook sat flat on the lake bed, but for me, if a hook sat flat on the lake bed, it's not in the correct position to catch hold in the fish's mouth. So that's why I like it sat. If it's sat like a claw like that, then instantly it's in the position that it needs to be to catch the bottom lip of the carp. If it's sat flat, it needs to physically move downwards before it's in the right position. So it's just a little edge that gives me confidence, and I think it catches me more fish. So then obviously we've got a Reflex Hooklink there, really supple, completely uncoated braid that folds up nicely in the bag. I've got a big overhand loop there, and that just means that I can tie up loads of these in advance and then loop them onto the swivel as and when. This is a 3-ounce lead. This is the lightest lead that I'd use. The reason I'm using this today is because I'm only doing short chucks on a small lake. So yeah, 3 ounce now, but I'd quite happily use a 4 or a 4.5. The bigger the better is a motto that I believe most men live their life by. And then going on from there, it's just a really short length of submerged leader, the 30-pound version. I tie up loads of these throughout the year, and they're just my little stems that I always fish my solid bag rigs on. So the only thing that I might change from that is the hook bait if I'm using a pellet bag, and I'd change the hook bait to that, which is a 8mm Northern Special Mini, really, really tiny, but also stupidly buoyant. And I find one of these sits up a size 6 stiff rig beak point hook, absolutely perfect for the solid bags. Like I say, I'd use this one if I'm using pellets in the bag, and I'd use a maggot hook bait if I'm using maggots in the bag, and it really is as simple as that. So maggots make up a massive part of my winter carp fishing armoury, and I think a lot of people would think that tying up solid bags with maggots can be quite an arduous task. They're not the easiest bait to work with, especially when using a solid bag, which isn't the easiest thing to tie at the best of times. However, if you follow a few simple rules, they do actually become really easy to tie. So firstly, I use the rapid system. Now, unless I'm chucking absolute ultimate distance, I'll use this for all of my solid bag fishing anyway. But in the winter, especially when using maggots, it makes it an awful lot easier. It opens up the bag nicely so you can just pour the maggots in. And of course, we're just twisting it, licking it and pressing it down. It makes the whole job a lot easier, and you're not having to fiddle around with freezing cold fingers trying to tie off PVA tape or PVA string around the top of the bag. Now, what I also do, as I mentioned before, is I put the maggots into a torpid state. I seal them off, take off all of the air from the bags, from the bag that they're in, and this means that they go dormant, and that way even if you're leaving them for sort of 2 weeks, as long as you keep them cold, they will stay nice and fresh. And you'll know that if they're not, you'll know that they've gone sort of bad simply by the smell. But these, I've had these in a bag for 2 weeks. I've used them on a few different sessions, and they're absolutely fine and perfect to use. So firstly, what I do to tie my bag is I put my rig that's got my Maggot hook bait on it into a pot of krill meal. The reason I do that is because when I've attached the maggots to the hook bait, you'll pierce the maggots, and often like a little bit of their sort of juice comes out, and that can melt the PVA. So I put it into the krill meal just to take away any of that moisture, to make sure that it doesn't melt the bag. Also, I'll do that after recast, etc. I'll drop my whole lead in, everything, just so that it soaks up that extra moisture and doesn't melt anything. Then I'll attach my PVA bag to my loading tool, make sure that I use the cold water version, or the fast melt version of the Rapide PVA. It's got a little snowflake symbol on, so you know that it's the cold water version, and it's the one in the blue packet. Now I use the smallest size and attach that to the loading tool. Then I drop my rig in, lock off my leader in the little V on the loading tool, and I make sure that the hook bait is, or the hook point is facing down, so that it's not going to be likely to catch hold onto any of the maggots, impeding the potential hooking properties of the rig. I then drop a small amount of krill powder on top of that, just to give it a bit of a barrier from the maggots, and then I drop a pinch of maggots in. On top of that, I drop my lead, so that it's central in the bag, and make sure that it's central in the bag so that it's nice and aerodynamic. I then fill up the rest of the bag with the maggots, so that the maggots come just over just to the top of the stem of the lead. And then there should be a gap of about 1.5 inches from the top of the maggots. Just had a liner. So that the maggots come within 1.5 inches of the loading tool. That gives me enough room to twist the loading tool, push it back over itself, giving the PVA around the loading tool a lick, continue to push it down. It then all fastens over itself, sticks together, and offers you a really nice bag. Simply fold the corners in. I do it by pushing them in, licking my finger, touching the PVA and just folding it over, and then the moisture transferred from my finger to the PVA is enough to stick it down. And then you end up with a really nice bag like that. Obviously it's got maggots in, so it's not going to be as tight and as compact as when you're using something like Palate, but believe me, I can chuck these probably about 120 yards, so more than enough for the majority of fishing that you're going to be doing in the winter time, and it's a really, really effective method. So we all know that winter fishing is really hard a lot of the time because of locating the carp. They're a lot more tightly shoaled, they don't show as much, they don't give themselves away as much. So a lot of the time you'll turn up to a venue and you won't know where to fish, and there'll be no signs, nothing will show you where to go or what to do. And in those situations, you know, using the solid bags is good. However, you need a little bit extra to let you know exactly where to put them, especially if nothing's showing. So what I tend to do is I'd put my solid bags out to areas that look likely, and then I'd fish for liners. So you can see here I've got the dumpy bobbins, which are actually quite a big bobbin. However, inside them there's a weight, and I've removed that weight, so they're not actually really, really heavy. However, they're heavy enough to take up the slack in the line, so that the line, when it absorbs water out in the lake, doesn't sink too much and doesn't draw the bobbin up. So you need enough weight to keep it down, but you don't want too much weight, so that if the fish gets into contact with the line, it doesn't pull up, and the fish sort of just, the line pulls off the fish without you getting that indication. So you need, I'd say, a medium weight bobbin for this, and I like the dumpy bobbins also because they are very big, very visual, and you can see line bites if you don't necessarily get the indication. So I'm fishing them at sort of a half drop so that I can get forward indication and backward indication, and also I've got the sensitivity on my alarms set to full, so even the slightest little movement on the bobbin and I'm getting indication. And if I'm getting indication and I'm not getting bites, say if I've fished for an hour and I'm getting line bites but no bites, then I'd bring my rigs, I'd bring my solid bags closer to me, with the idea being that the fish are hitting my line between where my rods are and where the hook baits have landed. So if I continue to get line bites again, another hour, I'll bring it closer again, hopefully until I start getting bites. So those are my top tips for solid bag fishing. This time of year, it is really, really effective and well worth having in your armoury. Remember to take those maggots with you, keep them sealed up in a plastic bag. Take your same pellet mix that you've always used because it's just as good now as it was in the summer, and make sure you keep your hook baits really small but lightweight so the hook is really well balanced. And if you do all of those things and put the bags in front of some fish, I'm pretty sure you'll catch this winter.